After all the effort of Lewis and Clark in 1803 to enlist and haul men and supplies down the Ohio River, it was the cusp of winter upon their arrival in St. Louis, a small settlement that would soon become the significant hub of passenger and trader traffic north and south on the Mississippi and west on the Missouri, across the prairies, to the Rocky Mountains and Pacific Ocean shores. Lewis made nearby Cahokia his base at first, from which he traveled back and forth to the St. Louis settlement. Clark led the boats further upstream to a site offered by a trader called by Sergeant Ordway the Camp River Dubois. It was December 12. The assembled corps at this point had to be sheltered and provisioned and entertained for several months before the springtime thaws assured more reliable movement of the accumulated crew and tons of supplies. The keelboat, a red pirogue, and a white pirogue of substantial sizes had to be sailed, pulled, pushed, lifted, and steered up a brown river, the Old Missouri, chock full of tree trunks, sandbars, and floating debris of every kind. The experiences of the Corps' enlisted men during roughly 4 months of Illinois winter could be summarized as a study in the psychology of mostly young athletic males confined to huts and a clearing in the woods. There were few opportunities to mingle with the St. Louis society, and especially the women there. Clark and Lewis themselves had various invitations to balls and dinners. In the springtime in St. Charles, the rest of the expeditioners did get to mix it up a little. White House journaled on May 18th, quote,
"Passed the evening very agreeable, dancing with the French ladies."
Meriwether's activities tended to keep him in nearby St. Louis. Clark's attention was mostly held at Fort Dubois, but complicated by a tendency of the men in periods of boredom to fight and to get drunk. Disciplinary actions were sometimes required, even an incident reported as mutiny. Early on, for instance, it seems that Ordway's commands, while Lewis and Clark otherwise were absent, were resented and even disobeyed by at least some men, including Coulter, who I have mentioned previously. Ordway, the only sergeant with Army experience, has been viewed in history as one of the most dependable members of the Corps. However, at first there apparently was dissent among the recruits and disobedience. At least a couple of men, probably including Coulter, had threatened to shoot Ordway and would not follow orders, leading to the court-martial overseen by Lewis. By April, the men had spring fever and were anxious to get going, but the logistics and circumstances delayed the actual start of the ascent of the Missouri until late May. Clark and Lewis had assembled a permanent party of 30 persons, including 17 regular soldiers, 11 enlistees, a half-breed, which is probably Drew Yard, to serve as an interpreter, Clark's black servant York, and Meriwether's dog. A contracted boat crew brought the party number to over 40. Their journey extended almost 8,000 miles round trip. Journals of the expedition were kept not only by Clark and Lewis, but also by Ordway, White House, Gass, and Floyd. Ordway's carries an entry for all 863 days of the formal expedition. Across the Mississippi, the winter campsite was east of the Mississippi on the bank of the Rivière au Bois, or Woods River. The men immediately proceeded to construct their living quarters modeled after a small fort to ensure comfort from cold and wind, and also a modicum of protection from possible unwelcome Indian incursion. After all, this was the frontier. Across the Mississippi was a vast American desert, at least as perceived at this time. Trappers and hunters had penetrated parts of it, but the map was mostly blank. Perhaps as many as 60 indigenous tribes were out there, plus many still unobserved and unreported plant and animal populations that Lewis had set himself a task to bring up to date. He would often trudge along the shoreline of the Missouri while Clark tended to the maintenance and progress of the boats. According to Clark's journal,
Captains Lewis and Clark wintered at the entrance of a small river opposite the mouth of the Missouri called Wood River, where they formed their party, composed of robust, healthy, hardy young men recommended.
The replica site of this camp today is located in a glen outside St. Louis, surrounded by mile after mile of oil and gas refineries, pipelines, manufacturing sites, and warehouses, with heavy traffic all around to boot. The huts and barracks are deteriorating. The quiet serenity of the place, though, still is haunted by the visiting ghosts of the frontier past. Lewis, housed in Cahokia, spent time acquiring, quote, information of the country. Meriwether soon was informed of the extent some white Americans had already crossed the Mississippi into the upper Louisiana and set up farms, some even with slaves. Perhaps their bold disregard of legality fitted partly into Napoleon's frustrated realization that it would likely be impossible in the future to block the Americans from swarming across the territory. Lewis reported back to Jefferson, molding Jefferson's apparent desire to force the return of these American settlers back across the river in order to convey the territory to the Indians. He also met with the Scottish explorer James Mackay, who with John Evans already had scouted 10 years before much of the Missouri Basin as far as the Mandan villages in the north. James filled in some of Lewis's misgivings and provided perspectives and mapping of known geographical and indigenous tribal concentrations. To secure vital supplies still, Lewis and Clark both became dependent on Auguste Chouteau, Pierre Chouteau, and family, prosperous traders and prominent wealthy merchants at the hub of the fur trade at the time. Another of the movers and shakers was Spaniard Manuel Lisa, who also attempted to steer deals with these representatives of the federal government to his own financial advantage. Before leaving St. Louis, Meriwether expressed anger over his dealings with these waterfront merchants, especially with Lisa, whose home he had actually visited, and Lisa's partner, Francois Benoit.
Damn Manuel and triple damn Mr. B. They give me more vexation than their lies are worth. I think them both great scoundrels.
Lisa later became a very rich river operator and trader of furs in the new territory, but also incurred the wrath and suspicion of many entrepreneurs forced to do business with him. Clark, meanwhile, hardly had a chance to leave the winter quarters and was even ill part of the time. The keelboat had to be refitted and balanced. The men needed to be disciplined and kept occupied with athletic and shooting practice. He finally got to spend some time in St. Louis in February and March. As spring rolled around, quote,
3 men went partying without leave.
According to Ordway, these otherwise good men behaved in an, quote,
unbecoming manner at the ball last night.
A court-martial the next day sentenced Warner and Hall to 25 lashes each and Collins to 50 lashes. This was standard military punishment, although Clark was inclined to leniency. After another whiskey frenzy, at least 4 men were confined to quarters for 10 days by Captain Lewis. On March 10, 1804, in St. Louis, Spain formally transferred the Upper Louisiana to France, which then gifted the papers to military representatives from the United States. The French tricolor came down and the stars and stripes went up the pole. Lewis and Clark no longer needed to be wary of trespass west of the Mississippi. Lewis was still communicating with Clark from St. Louis. Only on May 13 did Clark notify his companion leader that the keelboat and crew, now including 7 French boatmen, were set to depart up the Missouri. Lewis would meet everyone a few miles upriver at what is now the St. Louis suburb of St. Charles. Ordway kept notes, dated Monday, May 14, 1804.
Snowy day. Captain Clark set out at 3:00 p.m. for the Western expedition. 1 gun fired. A number of citizens see us start. The party consisted of 3 sergeants and 38 good hands.
I cannot be sure why they set off so late in the day, but perhaps weather was a factor. Roughly 4 to 6 miles later, they encamped. On May 16, the boats pulled into St. Charles settlement. Clark went ashore and enjoyed dinner with a mill owner and, quote, his charming wife, commenting on the man's elegant situation and excellent garden. Clark's journal.
We arrived at St. Charles at 12 o'clock. A number of spectators, French and Indians, flocked to the bank to see the party. This village counts about 100 houses, and most of them small and indifferent, and about 450 inhabitants, chiefly French. Those people appear poor, polite, and harmonious.
Later, as he had in the past, Lewis added the terms illiterate and lazy to his descriptive of the frontier folks. Lewis's attention is sometimes exposed to his elitist Eastern establishment upbringing. While at St. Charles, 2 privates were added to the party to act as guides and interpreters, namely Francis Labiche and one-eyed Pierre Cruzat. These were mixed-blood French and Indian métis. Finally, on May 20, Meriwether Lewis and some St. Louis notables arrived by horseback at the St. Charles encampment. Clark wrote,
A cloudy morning rained and a hard wind last night. Sent 20 men to church today. 1 man sick. Captain Lewis and several gentlemen arrived from St. Louis, though a violent shower of rain. Most of the party go to church.
The next day, all aboard the boats set off west on the Missouri to begin a historical exploration of the new land owned by the United States, but not secured. Seemingly a late departure, 4 p.m.